commodity production. This is basically a reinterpretation of, in my opinion, of Keynes' work, which was not mentioned in the work. So, one. Keynes, in the very last chapters of his general theory, which in my opinion is not the most important work Keynes has done, but one of the most important ones, clearly. He mentions that there is the single most important recipe for success to foster growth and investment is to euthanize the rentier. Basically, today we have the opposite. We have been euthanizing the real sector. The recipe for success in this story is to promote growth via regulation in financial markets that act against the waves that have been the waves of liberalization and basically favoritism towards the financial markets, and that limit their action. And this can only work worldwide because, of course, there's delocalization in at work and all that. So this is a very first interpretation by Krippner. A second interpretation is a switch from the Fordist accumulation mode of production, in which, of course, there is not only the massive production of, let's say, automobiles in this case, and in which workers are also an active part, not only of the production process, but also on the buying side. So we have we have witnessed a switch from this accumulation process to a finance-led accumulation regime, in which, of course, the most profitable activities today are not related to the real sector in this part of the world. Of course, this has been going on. That is the real production of things in other parts of the world, mainly China. So we also there's other definitions. I'm going to try to go over these very quickly. So there's this credit culture versus shareholder value creation, which we call the universal banking model, in which, of course, new processes and new challenges have been faced in the past 40 years, following several shocks that are related to the other shocks, but I'm not going to talk about them. Our focus here is on financialization as it is today. So the origins of financialization we do not deal with. I'm just going to talk about these three. So there is also increasing credit intermediation. There is a lot of mergers and acquisitions activity. Naturally, because there's more monopoly power, and this harks back all the way back to Kaletsky. And the banalization, I don't know how to say that in English, but of the too big to fail culture. So we are too used to too big to fail, so financial authorities, they prefer to protect the strongest simply because they are too important. In this case, we're talking about financial companies. And finally, Lazonic highlighted the use of leveraged stock buybacks to sustain the growth of earnings per share and senior management remuneration. So, without talking more about the definition, which we all already know, this is the starting point of our analysis. This is a very simple figure in which we can see the process. In A1, and A1 here, we see the link between private banks, firms, and households. The private sector gets indebted, and this debt comes from banks. Banks hold these debts, and it goes directly into the liability side of the private sector. This, in turn, accumulates into financial profitability. The more demand there is for debt, the more demand there is for equity, the more profitable it is. And as a consequence, this fosters predatory behavior on the part of financial actors. However, there is a limit to this. The limit is that this does not create wealth. Financial assets do not create wealth. They have to help. And usually their role is to aid the accumulation process in the real sector. This is not fulfilled in a financialist economy. As a consequence, and given also that there is a trade-off between investing, and I'm talking here about investors, a trade-off between investing in the real sector, investing in, let's say, real estate, construction, and other businesses, which are very important, of course, and investing in financial instruments, which are only contributing to the bubble. So the limit is profitability in the real sector. When this profitability starts to slow down, there is slowdown also in the production of goods and services. GDP goes down, and the expectations of profits in both the real sector and the financial sector go down as well. And as a consequence, the bubble collapses. This is the main idea behind this. And of course, because firms or households produce and employ people, not only in financial services and products, but also in the real sector. And if there is a slowdown in activity that is enhanced by the crisis and the loss of confidence, this will create, of course, negative effects in terms of production and employment. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy, of course, that fits itself over and over until there's a recovery. The recovery, clearly, since 2007 hasn't come. Now, I don't know if I have time to talk about the accounting, but actually I do. So I'm gonna show you very quickly so you have an idea of what the system looks like, and then I'm gonna focus on. So this is the publication I was talking about, and then I'm gonna show you this figure here. So this table here shows the 5 sectors we model in our economy. So we have households, column H, firms, banks, central bank, and the government. The lines here represent the operations. The first part of the matrix here, because this is a matrix and everything is balanced, that is to say, all that comes into the economy finds an exit. In the case of wages, for instance, these are paid by firms and received by households in our simplified economy. The first part of this matrix right here is the real sector. The real sector is made up of income and production. Basically, wages, profits, the income of the private sector, interest and dividends, which are the revenue of the financial sector, taxes, which is the revenue of the government, consumption and investment, the major items that make up domestic output. And then we have, underneath saving, we have 4 financial assets that have a right-hand side and a left-hand side, an asset and liability, holdings and owers of these liabilities. And notice that the focal point here is saving. Saving is actually in the middle because saving has 2 counterparts. First, in the real sector is the difference between income and expenditure. However, saving can also be allocated into other sectors, mainly the financial sector. Savings are not usually modeled explicitly in standard models, but we do it here because we know that the allocation of these financial assets has implications for accumulation in the real sector. More specifically, credit and equity. So this is the system, this is what it looks like. There's 5 sectors and all these instruments, real side and financial side. How do I get back to the... Sorry. Maybe I did. Sorry for that. So, well, the model is not only accounting. The model is actually based on behavioral equations. The behavioral equations are, of course, to the author's choice. We chose to include about 20 behavioral equations in this system, but I'm going to focus here on 4 only, which have to do with the mechanism of transmission from the financial sector to the real sector and vice versa. So these are for non-financial firms. The investment function includes I is investment, and it depends on its lags. We include some arbitrary lags just to show some inertia, with respect to previous values. It depends also on a measure of Tobin skew, which is basically market value, which we measure here as the value of equity, price of equity, and the volume of equity, divided by the stock of capital. Investment also depends on profits, the interest rate, and on past output. We cannot include output contemporaneously simply because investment determines output in the same period. So some lags have to be included here. Indebtedness here is defined as a ratio of total capital, of the stock of capital. And also we include some lags, and we make this depend on the interest rate and on another measure of Tobin skew, which is in volume form and not in value form. Equity issuing depends on profitability of equity, which depends in turn on its price, right here. And it depends also negatively on debt. Basically, the story is the following. Oh, sorry, here, financial profitability here depends on profit of the firm, profit in the real sector, and it depends also on the price of equity. So, everything happens in these two equations. If the private sector gets indebted more than it usually does, so there is a boost in indebtedness, as we assume in the simulations, there will be naturally an increase in this ratio here. As a consequence of the increase in indebtedness, there will be a relative fall in the share of equity in the liability side of firms. And as a consequence, delta E will fall. The relative scarcity of this equity will make the price of equity increase. And as a consequence, what we see here is a double, a two-sided consequence. First, an increase in indebtedness, and second, a bubble in financial markets, in equity markets. This is not usually explained in standard models, and not even in stock flow models. So we include both, and we see that after shocking the model in period 15, we see there's two shocks in here. The first one is a one-shot increase in indebtedness by firms. The second one is a permanent increase in indebtedness by firms. So the dashed line is the second one, and the solid line is the first one, the one-shot. We see the effect on the profit rate of firms. We see that it increases at first because, of course, they have more money to spend on their investment, but clearly this is not sustainable. In the medium to longer run, this creates the increase in indebtedness itself provokes the fall in the profit rate. The same thing happens with the wage bill. The wage bill decreases simply because firms have other payments to make. Interest payments mainly. And they also have to pay investors. Dividends increase. This is not seen here, but dividends also increase. So something similar happens. So interest received by banks increase permanently if we shock the model permanently. And it increases temporarily, but it remains above the baseline if the indebtedness increases in just one period. And of course, the stock of debt increases likewise. We see the effects now on the national income identity. The left-hand side panel shows the one-shot, the effect of a one-shot increase in indebtedness, and the right, sorry, this is the right. The left one shows the permanent increase, the effects of a permanent increase in indebtedness. In both cases, what we see here is that there is a tendency, with respect to the baseline, of GDP, consumption, and household investment to fall. The only thing that increases and eventually stabilizes or falls is private investment. These are the results of our simulated model. How true can they be if we work with only simulated data? Well, we put this to a test. And we include some of the variables that we include in our model in a panel data of 29 high-income countries that go from 1998 to 2014. So we include GDP growth rates, gross capital formation, the weight share of GDP. Up to here, we include all these variables in the model. However, as I said before, we model this in a closed economy. But in our more realistic empirical model, we include trade openness, public expenditure as a share of GDP. Public expenditure is also in the model, working population growth, and CPI inflation. So, before I continue, sorry, a remark here. We suppose that real sector prices remain stable, which is credible, noting that there has been virtually 2% inflation since 1985, broadly speaking, in the economies that we analyze. However, what we actually model is the price of equity, the price of bonds, and these two prices belong to the financial sector. These have not remained stable. So, we do, however, include CPI inflation in the panel data model. So we also include volume of domestic credit to the private sector in both in two forms, total and by banks. So we focus on all credit given by the rest of the world, by non-financial firms and other actors, and only focusing on banks. We build a financialization index. As I said before, we built two, but I'm going to focus here on only one, as the ratio of 1 plus the return on assets divided by 1 plus the liquidity measure, liquidity ratio, and all of this multiplied by 1 plus what we call a concentration index. So notice that the financialization index will increase when concentration increases, when there is more monopoly power from the part of banks, and there is also more return, higher return, unusually high return of assets, which of course do not match liquidity. The panel data modeling is well adapted for our purposes, well, simply because, well, there's a bunch of reasons that I'll let Celine talk to you about. Our first set of restrictive hypothesis assumes that financial variables respond to shocks faster than real variables. This is by nature true, simply because there is less adjustment, the adjustment process, the adjustment time in financial markets is slower than what it is in real sector activity. That is to say, in order to invest in financial markets, this can happen with a mouse in front of a computer, whereas producing goods and services, demanding them, buying them, and using them takes a lot more. Common elements of the analysis between the theoretical and the empirical models are the following. So the interest rate and the price of equity affect private investment with a lag. Interest payments and dividends affect the wage bill with a lag as well. Wages determine profits. Profits have a lag impact on private investment, and the wage bill affects consumption. This is all standard. The lag might be a little bit arbitrary, if you may, but we make it match as much as we could. Naturally, the growth rate of GDP, the growth rate of investment, and debt and the financialization index respond to changes in wages with a lag. So this is standard impulse response presentation. I'm not going to, as I said before, this is not the part that I made. But I'm going to focus here only on the effects of the financial sector. Thank you. Thanks so much. So I'm going to focus here only on the effects of financialization on the real sector. So notice that GDP and investment, which are these two lines here, are affected negatively by financialization. They are affected negatively by private banking, lending. And of course, GDP is affected positively by investment. The responses are not necessarily, how can I say, comparable. But notice that the fall in investment and in GDP are much stronger than the increase in GDP as it relies on investment. This is common of the financialization process. We know that economies today are more reliant on the evolution in financial markets and in banking activity. So, oh, sorry. I'll send the slides anyway. So, conclusion, just to finish this story, because I have how long? I start the clock anyways. So we're good. Currently, there's an increasing consensus that a set of significant macroprudential reforms must be implemented, and this advice comes not only from those who have always opposed financialization, but also from some of these people who initially created it. One of the citations I'm going to make in the next slide, it comes from an important figure, and you will see who. But so we all agree now that there should be the removal of the preferential accounting treatment of debt, so that debt should not be banalized. I don't know if there's a term in English, and it should be regulated, not only from the demand side, but also from the supply side. Predatory lending should be limited. We should also implement an aggressive antitrust policy in the banking sector, because as we have seen in the concentration index that we used, well, I didn't show you the figures, but financialization has increased because of monopoly power in the banking sector. These should be regulated. There has also been there should be an increase of minimum capital requirements. This has already been done in Basel III, but apparently some people think it's not enough. I do not necessarily agree with that, but I'll tell you why if you're interested. There's also a reform, there should be also a reform of the structure of the banking sector. That comes along with the second point. And there should be also a Tobin tax of foreign financial transactions in order to mitigate the effects of speculation in financial markets, which come mainly from from net lending countries. Monetary and fiscal policy tools must be re-evaluated. Again, this is nothing new, but of course we systematize the thinking, and of course now we're talking about we're summarizing the proposals made by others. And this is the first citation that I think it's interesting to look at. There should be an adoption of a 4% inflation target. This comes from, among others, Blanchard, De La Riccia, and Powell. As you know, Olivier Blanchard was the chief economist of the IMF for a period of time, and during this period he made some reforms that at first they went one way, that promoted the status quo today, and nowadays he's backfiring on his own ideas. This, I think, is progress, and this is, I think, what we should continue doing. Other authors, other people at the IMF, Blanchard is long gone from the IMF, Maurice Opsfeld and other people at the IMF mainly a set of authors, mainly from India, interestingly, Austri, Qureshi, Ghosh, and Lungani, have been promoting the use of capital controls, which is pretty amazing coming from the IMF. So, this adoption of a 4% inflation target instead of a 2%, as it is the case today, would leave room for further falls, for further reductions in interest rates that could reduce the debts of the private sector and could in turn foster private investment. There should also be an augmented Taylor rule which takes into account the negative effects on the financial sector. And there should be also a revaluation of the socially optimal top tax rate that has been significantly underestimated in recent years. This comes from, of course, Piketty and company. This effort should also will also involve development of new managerial tools in order to guide the behavior of economic agents. So this has implications at the society level, and of course this should come from the organization of firms, private firms, together and in coordination with the public sector, in a manner which is responsive to the interests of society. So I cite here, of course, one of the Roland Perez, who is here. Ethical and impact investment is one option. Social banking, alternative currencies, social stock exchange, and others that I don't have space to cite. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Luis. So now we have our moderator, Hiram, providing comments for each presentation. Following that, we will have questions and answers for each questions.
How much time do you think?
Up to you, 10 minutes for each one. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. We were obviously I was pretty much excited about reading all the papers. I didn't receive your paper, but I did look at the abstract and then I listened very carefully. I didn't see your paper. It was the paper that's already been in print, and it's in the journal of economic modeling. And I did have a third paper that obviously the presenters were not here today, but was interesting because in many ways it also brings to the fore some of the points I'd like to make. Now, as I was reading the papers, not so much, I'll start with maybe not right away with yours, but I would like to come back to you. It reminded me of how difficult my task was when I was trained with learning economics. How it was difficult in the sense that the theories that we studied were obviously very elegant and nicely presented within what I call the new classical framework. And then as we learned them and then got through what we call undergraduate to graduate, eventually for some of those who went to the economics work in the PhD level, we realized that there is a mismatch, a total disconnect between the theories we study and of course what we learn and we see in the economy, the true economy. So I'd like to basically come back to now to you, and then if you don't mind. Of course, the work you've done is very useful and necessary. Going through the literature, we do definitely see the exponential growth over a long period of time, pretty much from the early mid-90s to current period, which is about a 20-year period. And if you look at, of course, what you said about the exponential growth, we realize that financialization has occupied a central place in our way of looking at market evolution, and of course macroeconomic and microeconomic foundations of our system, simply because the economy has been very much going through cycles of crisis. In other words, what we see in the literature is the reflection of what we've been experiencing in the economy. You referred to Keynes, and I'd like to come back to what Keynes defined as crisis. Essentially for Keynes, crisis is inevitable. Why economic crisis? Because we systematically run into what we call a mismatch between total production and investment. Right? So there's no particular period within which, or at least there might be a lag in between the 2 years, where we have total production equal total expenditure. So systematically we're run into a potential crisis situation. Total production being different from total, obviously, expenditure, then we need public intervention. government intervention. So coming back to specifically to what you said, I'd like just to raise a few points. I'd like very much statistical to be analyzed. My only concern is, and of course we can discuss it further, there might be some questions from the floor, is how do we really build a very complex model that you used, you used a factor analysis approach to analyze a number of keywords. And among the keywords in the cluster you created, you looked at, for example, the word financialization, and you look at the core literature, and of course you identified some of the elements that go around more recent publications. I noted, by the way, that in your analysis, there were more books than articles to which you refer, at least on the first two slides that you said. There were 6 books on each of those slides and 4 articles, to which the reference was made. So one of the problems we have, and I think we should recognize, is what is the purpose of citations if they don't really serve any purpose other than being cited? In many of our literature reviews, we've realized that certain articles, you talked about Epstein, you talked about Krippner today, there are specific references. We obviously do what we call reference dropping, and we take them, we use them as a frame, and then around the frame we go on to a different path. So my question is, when you do analyze and analysis, what is the degree of what we I refer to as usefulness as to, of course, you establish the facts, you say that these are the core issues, you went into very interesting, I really enjoyed very much the idea of stages, and then you went from stage 1 to stage 2 and 3 and 4, but then my question is, and of course I do agree with Fatterger's, I studied also information studies, how he uses that tool to identify and of course classify. But then the question is, would there be a need for a stage 5, where we could eventually look at all these financial or financialization related topics and then eventually see what were the policy implications and how it related to specific policies. In other words, what we read in academia, is it important? What we learn in academia is important, but what we read and then how we use it, that might be as important. So probably there is a stage 1, and that's maybe something we can consider. But once we establish the classification of all the core issues, number of citations, journals, and of course here you went into a very daunting task of creating what we call sectors in terms of country, nature of article, geography versus economics. But for example, when it comes to geography and economics, there's an author who's been very important in the recent years, and he's a very critical author in many ways, Paul Krugman, in economic geography. And then he also goes into the idea of financialization through the spatial integration. So that is something that I didn't see, or maybe there is something which I didn't, that was going to come up. So in other words, what we refer to citations, the importance of citations may have its own limitation when we actually, as scholars, try to use them. But we do use them because there's no other way. No other way other than being used. Now, that's my comment. The second question, of course, I'd like to come back to with what Luis mentioned, and I did have a lot of notes because I had more time to go through the whole article. And I read it twice. It's obviously very interesting. It reminded me of all the things I had learned in macroeconomics. And of course, the modeling dynamic is something that is very much associated with the worldview as the scholars. You start by saying that here we've chosen 29 countries, panel of 29 countries of high-income countries according to this classification. In this panelized seat, by the way, I was really enchanted by the article. That was very, very, I think, intellectually stimulating. You talk about these 29 countries, but then I see obviously in this back panel a country like Cyprus and Croatia next to the United States and UK. If you go into the very fundamental assumptions we're making, these countries don't hold. I mean, you can lump them into what we call panel regression analysis, or maybe as you did the VAR analysis. But it may be problematic. Eventually, if you take them out, you might probably get something. And then you go on and then say the period we're studying, obviously that's fine, 1998 to 2014, that's absolutely a good period because we see the dynamic of financialization. It really starts with after World War II, all the way, then starts accelerating in the late 80s, oil shocks and all this stuff, and then the supremacy of dollar as the currency. And then of course we see that process increasing. And of course, Ashwin has written extensively on this issue. From mid-80s to the present, we are witnessing growing financialization. What I'd like also, however, to bring up is some of the assumptions you've made. For example, one of the assumptions you're making in your natural accounting modeling is that this economy is a closed economy that considers no inflation. Well, this might come as a contradiction to the very assumptions you make next page. How do we make the idea of inflation be not exist in the closed economy, whereby financialization and its sources are closely associated with the global dimension, the growth of stock and flow of investment, financial investments in a global world? In other words, it'd be hardly possible for any government or any actor in this market, including firms, to be outside the market. The market is the unifying factor that brings to the fore, obviously, flow, and then we partner. So that's one point that I wanted to bring up. But of course, I like very much the whole effort, which is intellectually very beautiful in terms of bringing what I call different dimensions, which is the relationship between what you call consumption and savings. Marginal percent you consume, obviously you don't speak, specifically, but then how that affects in terms of investment and savings and what is savings. Those things are macroeconomically very interesting from a theoretical point of view. And then, of course, you bring up the topic of, you refer to leverage, the concept of leverage. There are different forms of leverage. You don't specifically mention them. We can talk about the use of return on assets and not on equity. I have a problem with that. I think if we just look at assets as a, by the way, we're talking about financialization. For those who haven't read the article, we're talking about the construct, your financialization index construct. And within that index, you're using different ratios. In fact, you're using many ratios to build the construct. The problem with ratios is that they already take into account